Okay, so can you hear me fine, Rob? And how many people am I talking to? Oh, wow, nice crowd. Hello, everybody. That's awesome. Okay, so I'm going to start off and I'm going to share my screen in the first instance. And great to have you there, Bruno. Bruno will answer all the questions that I can't answer. Okay, so I'm going to share that. And I'm going to go back to Keynote. And we're going to play. Okay. You should see my screen now, my main slide. Somebody give me a thumbs up that you can see the first slide. Yep, got the thumb. Thank you. All right, so welcome everyone tonight, and it's a pleasure to be with you. My name is Don Wallar. I have been hanging around Reasons to Believe for a very, very long time. I first met Hugh Ross, who's the former president and founder of Reasons to Believe, maybe known to some of you, if not all of you. In 1984 was the first time I met him. I was living in South Africa at the time, and he came to speak there. And a friend of mine who was doing her PhD in geophysics, said, Don, you've got to come and hear this guy. So I did. I went and I heard I heard Hugh, and then I thought, wow, I'd love to be involved with that organization someday. Little did I know I would be. And fast forward quite a few years, and I met Bruno at an event in Toronto, and the two of us had a shared passion for Reasons to Believe, and we started a small group, which eventually evolved into the Toronto chapter of Reasons to Believe, and that was established 11 years ago. So Bruno has, the last couple of years, been serving as the president, and I support him in any way I can. I'm also a member of the operating board of directors of RTB Canada, where I get to have some input into the strategic elements of Reasons to Believe in terms of the growth of the organization. So anyway, a very big welcome to you, and very privileged to be able to speak to you tonight. We're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 1 mostly, and our sort of format is to basically look at what the Bible says and what science has to say, and we're going to see where that takes us. But before we do that, I want to just establish a few definitions and some background for our talk. And by the way, at the end of this, I'm happy to take any questions that you may have, and I will hang around until the last question is asked. And like I said, anything I can't ask, Bruno will be happy to do that. So anyway, let's talk about something, a term you may have heard of, and that's naturalism. Basically, naturalism is a worldview, and by worldview we mean a complex definition of how you take data and filter it into your mind and conceive of or produce a way of viewing everything that exists in the universe. And naturalism, by definition, only allows natural explanations for things like the origin of the universe, the origin of galaxies, the origin of the solar system, the history of the earth, of life, and of humans, for example. Only natural explanations, which means basically scientific explanations. Supernaturalism allows for natural explanations as well, but does not exclude supernatural explanations for observed phenomena. So you can imagine that these two things, naturalism and creationism, as it is broadly known, are essentially two opposing worldviews. They don't agree on the basic presuppositions of how to view the world and the universe. And that's important to know whenever you're having a discussion with someone. The second thing that I wanted to mention is that God has revealed himself in two primary ways. We call them the two books. They're not really books at all, but two primary ways. The first, of course, is the Bible, which is God's greatest revelation. But the second way that he has revealed himself, which even the Bible says in books like Romans, for example, he's also revealed himself in nature, the record of what we see in his creation. Now, if it's his creation, then there's some things that we should expect. The first is that they should not contradict each other. In other words, the Bible and the book of nature or the record of nature should not contradict each other. Now, here's the problem, though. At its face value, that's a true statement, I believe. But the fact is that we interpret both the Bible and the record of nature. The first we call theology, and the second one we call science. And so sometimes we will get contradictions, but it's not because the Bible fundamentally and the record of nature are fundamentally at odds. It's our interpretations of one, the other, or both that can lead to these contradictions. The last thing I wanted to mention is the Bible and the scientific method. I'd love to see a show of hands. I know I can't, but be interesting for me to know how many scientists there are in the room. By scientists, I mean people who have studied science as their sort of background in university and so on. Okay, so a number of you. That's great. Wonderful. I'd love to know what your disciplines were, but that's for another time. Maybe during Q&A. But the thing that you may shock you is that the scientific method actually was mentioned in the Bible first. And you may say, well, where is that? And it's in Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 21. It says, test everything and hold on to the good. Now, I know that the context of that verse has to do with things like false prophets and false prophecy and false teaching and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, it's a principle that the Christian worldview, Judeo-Christian worldview has, and that is that nature, what we see in nature, is not an illusion. It is not something that God uses to trick us. He is not trying to deceive us with his creation, but in fact, reveal himself in his creation. And so God himself, through the scriptures, says, you should test everything and hold on to that which is good, that which is true, that which is right, etc. So with those 4 points, let's dive into our discussion. We're going to come back to these things at different points. All right, so let's talk just a little bit more about the scientific method. What exactly is that? So for people who are not trained in the sciences, this will be helpful to you. So the first thing that we do whenever we're talking about any kind of scientific experimental setup is we identify the frame of reference. What do I mean by the frame of reference? Okay, so how many of you have been sitting in a car and you turn to your right and you notice that the car beside you is moving forward, but you think you're falling back. You haven't got your foot on the brake. You're actually going backwards and you're about to bash into the person behind you. The fact is, that is an illusion because what really is happening is the person beside you is moving forward. So this is a classic example of frame of reference. From your frame of reference, it looks like you're going backwards, but in fact, Their frame of reference is you're going backwards because they're going forwards. So that's the difference between frame of reference. And it's very important that we understand that. Otherwise, we haven't even got a starting point. The second thing we do is we determine the initial conditions. What is going on in terms of those basic initial conditions? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it warm? Is it light, dark, whatever? The third thing is we observe. Notice that we haven't observed until we get to point 3 here. What takes place, when it takes place, and where it takes place. The fourth is we then note the final conditions. After the process or whatever it is we're observing is finished, we look at the final conditions, and then we form a hypothesis. A hypothesis is basically our idea of what we think has happened in terms of what we've observed. We then test the hypothesis with further observations, more study, or experiments, and eventually the hypothesis becomes a scientific theory and then fact. So that's the process of science. That is how science is actually supposed to be done. And it is largely done that way. One of the ways that keeps this scientific method at the forefront is the concept of peer review, meaning that you can't just claim whatever you want. You have to be able to prove it to peers who will then conduct the same set of experiments that you've done and hopefully reach the same conclusion. And if they don't, well, guess what? Then you have a discussion, and one of you is incorrect, or the hypothesis needs refinement. Okay, enough of that. So our format tonight is as follows. We're going to take each significant event in the prehistoric past, and we're going to ask, what does the Bible record, the biblical record in Genesis, say about that? Then we're going to ask the question, well, what does nature say? And we're going to see if there's any connection between those two. Now, before I go on, you need to understand something that's important, and a lot of Christians are not aware of this. And that is that Genesis is only one of over 25 major sections of the Bible that deal with creation. I can provide that list to Rob later if anybody is interested. I can email it to you and you can pass it around. But there's 27 actually major sections of the Bible that talk about creation. And I don't mean one or two verses, I mean whole sections. Now, any book that claims to discuss the origins of the universe, of matter, of energy, etc., should at least be consistent with or concordant with what we observe in nature. What do I mean by concordant? Basically, it means aligned. It doesn't have to be exact, but it should be in such a way that the two complement each other. That's what concordism is. Now, if you're a theologian, you'll know that concordism is a fancy theological term, and there's strong concordism and there's weak concordism, etc., etc. I'm not going to get into that. Do other holy books have this concordance with nature? Islam, for example, has several scientific claims. That might surprise you to hear that, but they do, in the Quran, and they're completely incorrect or not really true scientifically. And if you're interested, anybody has a question, I can show you a few slides on that, but I don't want to make that a major point tonight. I'm just mentioning it in passing, because if you're going to compare religions, then one of the ways you can compare it is, well, how close is your religious views to science? Does it, does it mean I have to throw my scientific brain out the window, or can I be a Christian and actually, or a Jewish person and actually believe the Bible? And that's what we're exploring tonight. Okay, let's get started. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I want to show you, and I'll do this throughout my talk, in brackets is the Hebrew word, in this case, for the word created, and that word is bara. And we're going to come back to this in a moment and talk a little bit about bara and why it's a special word. So the Bible opens with a profound statement that the universe had a beginning. And The word created, the Hebrew word bara, means to bring forth something completely or radically new. Something radically new. It's not based on something pre-existing per se, but something that has been created by God from nothing. Okay. Secondly, there's this phrase, the heavens and the earth. Well, what does that mean? Well, it comes from a Hebrew phrase, which is very interesting. The Hebrew phrase here is Hashamayim vet haaretz, which means basically the whole of creation, everything, the universe, space, time, matter, energy, black holes, white holes, neutron stars, pulsars, everything. Of course, the Bible writers knew nothing of most of those things, but the point is the term captures everything. So it's the whole physical universe. Okay. Now, just coming back to this word bara, we're going to see as we go forward that not everything new mentioned in Genesis is actually new. In many cases, the new thing was already there, and God brings it to life or brings it to visibility. And I'll show you what that means in a moment. All right. What does the record of nature say? Well, guess what? Most scientists, especially astrophysicists, cosmologists, and astronomers, will tell you that one of the greatest discoveries of the 20th century was that the universe had a beginning. This was in fact shocking to many scientists, including Einstein, by the way, who was really not happy about this idea. And Einstein publicly acknowledged that when he first did his space-time theorems, he introduced a factor which allowed for what we call an oscillating universe, which means that the universe would expand, contract, forever. In other words, the universe had always been and will always be. And when he was shown some observations through the Hale telescope, Palomar in California, he had to recant basically and admit that it was the greatest error of his entire scientific career. And that's all public knowledge, by the way. I'm not making any of this up. You can read it for yourself. And what scientists came to understand was that the universe had a beginning. From nothing, suddenly there was something. Now, we can contrast this with some pantheistic religions, for example, that claim that life is cyclical and it's eternal. You can think of Hinduism, for example, where they talk about the circle of life, you know, a la the Lion King. And the idea being that life is cyclical. You go forward, you come back. You through the process of reincarnation and other things, you're constantly cycling through life. But life has been forever. The universe has been forever, and it will never end. And that's a pretty dismal worldview, if you ask me. But the Bible tells us that it had a beginning, and science corroborates that. Nearly 14 billion years ago, all matter, energy, space, and time came mysteriously from nothing. The universe at that point expanded, and it cooled, and it matured. Now, many people have this notion, because of the term the Big Bang, that the universe exploded into being, and that is not true at all. It's a really bad choice of words. It was coined, in fact, by Fred Hoyle, who was an astronomer, in a pejorative way in the 1960s, when he said to someone, when the data started showing that there was a beginning, he said, "Oh, I suppose it was like a big bang," and the term stuck, but he meant it in a pejorative way. And so it became popular, and I'm sure you've all heard the term. But the reason why I have a problem with that term is because if you actually talk to astronomers or astrophysicists, they will tell you that the expansion of the universe was anything but an explosion. An explosion is a chaotic, uncontrolled, dispersive process, right? It's like they talk about SpaceX whenever they launch one of their rockets and they blow up. I love the terminology the engineers use. They say it has an unscheduled disassembly. Well, you know, we call that it blew up, but they call it an unscheduled disassembly. Anyway, I hope you're all laughing. The point is that the beginning of the universe was an expansion that was controlled to an almost infinite degree. And we don't have time to get into it tonight, but we will be talking a little bit about this notion of fine tuning and the universe being finely tuned, all the physical parameters. And one of the most important elements of the universe was the expansion rate and how it expanded. And it turns out that if it had expanded any other way than the way it did, we wouldn't be here. Life would not be here. There'd be no universe. And so even from the very infinitesimal singular beginning of the universe, there was this incredible control over how that universe expanded and cooled and matured. Okay. So with that expansion, we saw stars and galaxies forming. And one galaxy in particular, the Milky Way, formed in the ideal place at the ideal time and had the ideal shape. There are many different kinds of galaxies in the world, or in the universe. Our galaxy, the Milky Way, is a spiral galaxy. Some of you may know that. It's not unique in the universe. There are other spiral galaxies, many of them, but ours is somewhat unique in the distribution of the arms. Now, when we use the word ideal, I'm referring to what's known as the anthropic principle, which states that the physical conditions of the universe, our galaxy and our solar system and our planet, appear to be finely tuned for the support of human life. If those physical parameters were anything different, we would not be here. And there are many scientists, not necessarily believers, who have said that it seems as if the universe knew we were coming. And that's the anthropic principle. About 5 billion years ago, again, at the ideal time for life, our sun formed from a giant cloud of gas and dust in the Milky Way galaxy. And dozens of planets, including Earth, formed from a giant disk of this material rotating around this pretty ordinary star. All right, let's get back to Genesis for a moment. Genesis and the record of nature up until this point agree on this, that there was a beginning to it all, and that from nothing came something. Okay, that's pretty good. Let's move on. Verse 2. Now, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering, or rakaf, over the waters. Rakaf means to brood over, to cherish, to bring life to. It's used in a number of different ways in the scripture, but you get the idea. Now, it's important at this point that we stop and ask ourselves the question about the frame of reference. Where are we at this point? By the writer of Genesis stating this, we have moved from the whole universe to the surface of one planet, where presumably or supposedly the Spirit of God is now hovering and brooding over. So we're on the surface of this primordial earth. And that's important for us to remember this frame of reference, because the rest of Genesis does not make sense unless you understand the frame of reference of the writer. Okay, let's move on. What about the record of nature? About 4.6 to 4.25 billion years ago, thick gases from the early atmosphere, together with the interplanetary dust that existed in the solar system, left the Earth's surface dark as night. It was dark. There was no way that any light could get through. The sun is there, but no light can get through. Now, you might say, well, is there any scriptural references that can support that? Yeah, well, there's a number. Job 38:9 says, when I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness. Psalm 104:5 and 6 says, he set the earth on its foundations, it can never be can never be moved. You covered it with the watery depths as with a garment, and the water stood above the mountains. So we've got this notion of a thick gaseous atmosphere over a planet covered in water. All right, we move forward in time to a very major event known as the Late Heavy Bombardment. And this occurred approximately 3.9 billion years ago, when a lot of meteors bombarded the Earth and the Moon, by the way, and blasted debris into this already thick atmosphere. There was no light reaching the surface of the Earth, and the planet was definitely devoid of life. Okay? And if you want to have evidence of this, just look at the moon one night through a good pair of binoculars and you can see what happened a long time ago. All right. So where are we at in terms of our concordance? Well, both Genesis and the record of nature agree that the surface of the young earth was dark and it was empty of life. Now, as we go forward, we're going to see in the rest of Genesis 1, which is just one small chapter, how the Lord prepares the newborn planet Earth for humanity, starting with the critical first ingredient. And it's important for us to keep this in mind. Genesis is not a scientific textbook. It was not written for scientists to take apart and publish papers on it. All we're trying to establish here is that our faith in the Bible, and in particular, the record of creation, is not out of alignment with science, which is so popularly held. So many people, and I'm sure you know them, say, wow, you believe in God and the Bible, fine, I believe in science, as if the two are completely on opposite ends of the room. They're not. And that's what I'm trying to point out tonight. But in doing so, I want you to understand that I am not saying that everything in the Bible is perfectly aligned with every single thing you could ever come up with and ask. It's not, because it wasn't written to do that. It was written to convey this important truth that you see on this slide. And that is that everything that God did, he did for us to prepare the planet and the solar system and the universe for us. And that's an extraordinary idea. So what was the critical first ingredient that came next in this dark, watery world? Well, the first one was light. And here's the verses 3, 4, and 5. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Now, I want you to notice that the Hebrew word for appear, let the light appear, was haya, not bara, meaning that the light is allowed to be seen, is what haya means. It's as if you had a light and you took a cover off the light and now everybody can see it. The light was there, but no one could see it. You remove the covering and now everyone can see it. That's what the word in the Hebrew word haya means. And it's interesting that the word bara is not used here because it was not a new thing. It already existed. The Hebrew word yom is another important word to talk about. That's the word for day. And the Hebrew, as you may know, has a much more limited vocabulary than English, for example. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 1/3 of the vocabulary. And so Hebrew words have a tendency to mean multiple things. And that's even true today in modern Hebrew. But in ancient Hebrew, for sure, that was the case. So the word yom can be translated as a number of things. One of the things it can be translated as is a 24-hour day, or what we call a solar day. What you and I all understand is, I got up at 7 and I went to bed at 7 and I got up at 7, 24-hour day. Or it could mean a time or period of time without any reference to solar days at all. For example, the expression you'll see in the scriptures like, and in that day, the Israelites did this and that and whatever thing. We all know that it wasn't a literal day. It meant a period of time. It was in a period in history where the Israelites did whatever they're referring to. Okay. The Hebrew words translated as evening and morning here also mean end and beginning. Now, this might be something new to you. The word for evening is erev, erev. The beginning of darkness, dusk, twilight, nightfall, closing, ending, or completion are all legitimate interpretations of the word erev, and it's used that way throughout the scriptures. The second word for morning is boker, boker. And that means the breaking forth of light, dawn, daybreak, or morning, dawning, or beginning, or origin. All of those things boker can mean. Now, one of the things you may not have noticed is that when we read this statement, and it was evening and it was morning the first day, and it was evening and it was morning the second day, and it was evening and morning the third day, all through Genesis, you may have noticed that that's an unusual way of speaking. Normally, we would say, well, there was morning and there was evening the first day, right? And so the scholars have looked at this and they've said, wow, that is an unusual use of those two words. Why would you put evening and then morning? And so the idea here is that a lot of scholars believe that the order is significant because it means the ending of something and the beginning of something else. So the end of a period of time and the beginning of a new period of time, not necessarily a 24-hour solar day. So this understanding of yom is really important. Now, even in the scriptures themselves, there are numerous examples where the word day or yom clearly does not mean a 24-hour day. I'll just give you a few examples and you can go and look them up. But Genesis 2:4, which is right next chapter in Genesis, it says, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord made heaven and earth." Well, Genesis 1 is several days, 6 to be precise, and here it's just one day. If you look at Zechariah 14:6-9, Isaiah 34:8, Hosea 6:2, there are numerous scriptures that use this term day that it clearly does not mean a 24-hour period of time, but rather a period of time with an undefined beginning and end, just a period. And for this concept of morning and evening, I would refer you to Psalm 90, verse 5 and 6, because there the same idea is used and helps to explain this notion of beginning and end. Okay, what about the record of nature? So about 3.8 to 3.5 billion years ago, This cosmic bombardment was slowing down, and the water on the planet was cooling. When the late heavy bombardment happened, it vaporized a lot of water. It turned it into basically into steam and water vapor. It was cooling, it was condensing, and this allowed for a shallow sea on the planet Earth, the early planet Earth. The thick skies were thinned enough to be translucent to the sun's light, but not transparent. The sun was not yet visible to an observer on the Earth. Okay? There was light, and because of that, there was a discernible solar night and solar day. So the Earth would get dark at night and get lighter during the day. But if you were alive back then, you wouldn't know why. So again, this is what scientists believe about our planet's evolution. And isn't it interesting that it lines up pretty well with what Job said and what some of those other scriptures said that I shared with you? So I think we can say this, that Genesis and the record of nature agree, at least, that light was the first of life's ingredients to appear on the scene. Most scientists would agree with that. Without light, you can't have life. And so isn't it interesting that the Bible has light as the first thing that happens after the earth is formed? So let's turn now to the next important ingredient for life. You probably guessed it, and that is water. So reading in verses 6, 7, and 8, God said, "Let there be an expanse between the waters to separate the water from the water." So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it, and it was so. God called the expanse sky, and there was evening, and there was morning the second day. So again, have a look at these two words here in Hebrew. You'll notice that the first word there, let there be, is the same as the word appear, which is the Hebrew word hayah. So let the expanse appear. God then manufactured or made the expanse. So he did something to separate basically the sky from the surface of the watery earth. And again, it's not new. This is not a bara creation. It's making something out of what pre-existed. And we're introduced to another Hebrew word here called asa. Asa. The Hebrew again strongly implies that God manufactured something out of already existing material. Okay? We know from verse 2 that the water already existed. God used the pre-existing water to manufacture the water vapor atmosphere above the liquid water on the surface. Okay? Let's look at Proverbs 8, 27 and 28, just as another one of those scriptures that kind of corroborates this. I was there when he set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizon on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above and fixed securely the fountains of the deep. That's pretty amazing, I think. Okay, what about the record of nature? What would scientists say? Well, here's what they would say. About 3 billion years ago, Earth had aged and cooled to where the shallow sea was finally establishing a very important thing for life, and that is a stable water cycle. Does everybody understand what a water cycle is? Basically, you've got the heat hitting the surface of the Earth, causes evaporation of the water goes up into the sky, condenses into clouds, rain comes back down, waters the Earth. The water gets heated up, goes back up into the sky, clouds form, down comes rain. That is a water cycle, but it needs to be stable. You may not know this, but you live in a very stable water cycle. Despite what everybody says about climate change, trust me, we are in an incredibly stable situation, relatively speaking, on planet Earth today, because without it, we would not be here. So a stable water cycle is critical for life on any planet. It turns out that the Earth just happens to have the ideal distance from the sun, the ideal orbit around the sun, the ideal sized star, and the Earth itself is the ideal size, with an ideal sized moon, by the way, that allows for this life-giving solid liquid gas cycle. Now, there are many things about the Earth and its position in our solar system that are extremely fine-tuned to permit the presence of three phases of water simultaneously. You understand what a phase is, okay? So water exists in three different phases: solid, ice; liquid, water; and gas, water vapor, okay? The molecular structure of water itself is incredibly unique, and it gives rise to its physical properties. Things like its melting point, its boiling point, its viscosity, et cetera, a whole bunch of other things. Heat of evaporation, all kinds of physical parameters. All of these parameters are finely tuned to enable water to exist in three phases. Most elements or most molecules do not behave like water. Water is incredibly unique. And so we have all these parameters that are incredibly finely tuned, and we have water itself, just a simple molecule of an oxygen and two hydrogens that just has the right angle that allows for water to behave the way it does. I'll just, a quick little aside. Some of you may know that every winter here in Canada, all the lakes freeze. Have you ever wondered what happens to all the fish and all the other organisms that are in the lake, why they don't die? And the reason is because when water hits 4 degrees Celsius, exactly 4 degrees Celsius, it is the most dense it will ever be. You might have thought that ice is more dense, but actually it isn't. It's less dense than water at 4 degrees C. How do I know that? Because ice floats. So if ice didn't float, if it sank to the bottom, it would kill everything. Everything would freeze and be dead. But one of the properties of water that is so amazing is that at 4 degrees Celsius, exactly 4 degrees Celsius, it achieves its highest density and goes to the bottom of our lakes. And that's where all the life goes, because they can live down there. They're slowed down a bit and they kind of hibernate, but that's okay. They're alive. So that's an amazing thing. And if you're a scuba diver like I am, you find out real quick that if you dive in a lake in the late autumn or early spring, if you go past a certain point, it's exactly 4 degrees Celsius down there. So you better be dressed accordingly. Okay, let's move on. So Genesis and the record of nature again agree that a life-giving water cycle was established very early in Earth's history. So the stage is now set for the next step toward a good Earth. And that is the formation of land. Okay, how are we fixed for time? Rob, are you still there? Do we need a break or should we keep going? Hey, Bruno. Are we good? Give me a thumbs up to keep going. Okay, very good. All right. So let's read the scripture from verse 9 and 10. God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. And God called the dry ground land, and gathered the water, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Now, guess what? We have another new word. It's like, man, all these Hebrew words, why couldn't they just had one or two? There's a number of them. And like I said, Hebrew hasn't got a huge vocabulary, but it certainly has a number of different words, like we do, for things that are made, manufactured, built. They're all different words that kind of mean the same thing, but they have different nuance, right? Same in Hebrew. So here we have this word become visible, or ra. Ra means to be seen, to appear, to show forth, to cause one to see, to be perceived or beheld, to be considered. So slightly different meanings. But again, it's not bara. There's nothing radically new. It's just something, now land, being allowed to appear. The raw material to make the land masses already existed. God made it somewhere previously. Psalm 104, verses 5 to 9 say this: He set the earth on its foundations. It can never be moved. You covered it with the watery depths as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. Isn't that interesting? The water stood above the mountains. But at your rebuke, the waters fled. At the sound of your thunder, they took to flight. They flowed over the mountains. They went down into the valleys to the place you assigned for them. You set a boundary they cannot cross. Never again will they cover the earth. Isn't that fascinating? Again, pretty interesting. I mean, if you read in the Psalms that, a fire-breathing dragon came and landed on the planet and breathed all over the water, and that caused the changes in the land appeared. Well, okay, but it's not. The Bible is not fantastical like that. It is very clear what the writer of the Psalms was inspired to say, and it's concordant with the record of nature. Because about 3.5 billion years ago, these gigantic dome-like granite blocks slowly began to force their way up through the crust of the earth and expose themselves above the sea. About 2.5 billion years ago, the earth had settled into stable land masses. And by stable land masses, I mean the major masses of the earth. Here's kind of a picture of the primordial earth as has been imagined by scientists and certain artists. There was now land and sea. Afterwards, after all this happened, the movement of land was mostly lateral. There wasn't this pushing up and exposing new land from below the sea, but rather a movement on the surface of the earth, what we call plate tectonics. And we can experience that today. How do we experience that? Well, you probably are familiar with the notion of, earthquakes and volcanoes. Plate tectonics basically allows for the recycling of land. You have erosion from the outer parts of continents into the sea, but then you have volcanoes and earthquakes which cause new land to be pushed up from underneath, not in the same way as in the past, these giant, huge land masses, but rather through volcanoes and other, you get a replenishing of the surface of the earth with more land material from below. And this cycle goes on all the time. I don't have time to get into it, but trust me, if you study about earthquakes and volcanoes, you'll find out that they are essential for life on any planet, including planet Earth. We tend to see them as bad, bad, bad. But it's only bad if you build your house right next to one. So they are necessary for life and the recycling of a lot of elements and materials that are necessary for advanced life. So it's a renewal process, and we get to see that every single day. All right. Genesis, and again, the record of nature agree that the next major event was the formation of land surrounded by water. Notice that we're building a case here that Genesis is basically so far having the order correct of creation. The order, what happened, then what happened, then what happened, seems to be exactly the same as what planetary evolutionists would say happened on any, or would happen on any planet, and did happen on our planet. So the stage at this point is set for the next thing in Genesis, and that is land plants. Verse 11, then God said, let the land produce or bring forth or sprout, the Hebrew word dasha, vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it according to their various kinds, and it was so. The land produced, yatsa, vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds, and God saw that it was good. There was evening and morning, the third day. Now, plants were not created on day 3. It just says, let the land become green. There's no reason to believe that plants were created because the use of the word bara is not here. It's not a new creation. The plants already existed at some point in the past. And what God is saying is, okay, let them appear. Let them show up on the land now. So this was an appearance thing again, hence the use of words like dasha and yatsa, not bara. So no bara, nothing radically new at this point. The record of nature tells us that with carbon dioxide and water, with land and light, plants which had been confined to or below or at the surface of the waters were being established on land. And this period started about 3 billion years ago with the algae, blue-green algae. Now, they are incredible microorganisms, and they are so important to the early Earth's history. And here in Canada, we're incredibly privileged because up near Thunder Bay is a formation known as the Gunflint Formation. And it is one of the best examples on Earth where you can see the earliest evidence of these blue-green algae dating back to this period. And they're known as stromatolites. And it's basically mats, if you like, of fossilized algae that date from this period. And these algae were absolutely critical in altering the Earth's early atmosphere. Remember that the atmosphere at this point is still kind of, translucent. It's not clear like we have it today. So something had to happen that changed the atmosphere, and the algae played a huge role in this, because they were photosynthetic and could fix carbon dioxide and produce oxygen. Other plants like ferns and ancient plants related to ferns played a huge role. All these plants on land and in the water would dramatically change the planet. So Genesis and science agree that plant life on land was the next significant event in the young planet Earth. Okay, now we come to something interesting. We're at day 4 of Genesis, and we have the appearance of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Let's read together from verse 14 and 15. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years. And let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. Notice the word haya, which you've seen before, and that is allow to be seen or to appear from previously being hidden. Again, we notice that this is not a bara creation, but it's something which pre-existed and it was brought forth, in this case, allowed to be seen by an observer on the surface of the earth. And that's why frame of reference is so important. Clearly, if your frame of reference was in outer space, you would have known the sun was there all along. But if you're an observer on the surface of the earth, which was the perspective of the writer of Genesis, then the sun, the moon, and the stars, although they were there, could not be seen clearly. But now they could start to be seen. And this explains one of the biggest arguments that scientists have leveled against the Bible, to say, how can you have plants before the sun, moon, and the stars? Like, that's ridiculous. You can't have plants without the sun. So the Bible didn't even get the order right. Aha! But that's because you don't understand the idea of frame of reference. Okay. So God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. It was evening and morning, the 4th day. Okay? All right. The Hebrew here tells us that the lights were caused to appear, and I already mentioned that about Haya. Genesis tells us a couple of things here that are very interesting. it's not just, okay, so the lights appeared. So now we can see the sun, now we can see the moon. But it's why. God gives us a really important why here. And he tells us that the when of the sun, the moon, and the stars appeared visibly to an observer on planet Earth, and the why they were created. And they were created in order to basically establish what we call bioclocks, which many, many animals rely on. If you've ever studied anything about migration of birds, you know that the day and night cycle and a whole bunch of other factors, the magnetic uh, um, uh, lines around the Earth and all kinds of other parameters dictate when the birds migrate and gives them the accuracy that they have in going from one location to another. Hibernation. I mean, I could go on and on. You guys know this. There are many, many things that animals depend on. And it's interesting, too, that if you look at carnivores and herbivores, which one is up when, even that is interesting. One's more at night, one's more during the day. So the point here is that this day-night cycle established seasons, years, months, and days, all established by these lights in the sky. Okay, what about the record of nature? Well, about 2 billion years ago, scientists believe that the atmosphere, which was once thick and dark, like we talked about, for many reasons, began to thin even more. And the once translucent sky eventually became transparent, very much like we have today. The sun and the moon and the stars were there all along, but they make their first very clear appearance to the surface of planet Earth. Genesis and the record of nature agree that the clearing of the atmosphere came after plant life was established on land, and that the skies played a major role as clocks for life, or bioclocks as we call them. All right, so let's summarize. Where are we at? From about 1 billion years ago to 500 million years ago, our planet was like this. There was an atmosphere which included about 20% oxygen. There was an established water cycle. There were stable land masses, plants, protection from ultraviolet rays from an ozone layer, and visible sun, moon, and stars for potential bioclocks. So the stage was set for the next big thing. And the next big thing was animals. We're going to look at this in two parts. Let's look at verses 20 and 21. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, shiras, and let the birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." So God created bara. Woo! Look at that. There's that word again. This is only the second time it's happened that we see this word. So God created bara, the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing, nephesh, in other words, we'll talk about in a minute, with which the water teems according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening, there was morning, the fifth day. So we see here the Hebrew text using the word bara for the first time since verse 1, which tells us that something brand new is being created at this point. Now, later on, we're going to see that God also made the animals and uses the Hebrew word asa. In other words, these brand new creatures, they're brand new, but they're also manufactured from pre-existing materials. So what's new about them? Well, we're going to talk about that now. Included in God's creation during this period are what we call the nephesh creatures. These are what are referred to as the vital animals, animals that clearly manifest the soulish attributes of mind, will, and emotion, animals which will later prove to be vital to God's next creation. How many of you have a pet dog or cat? You know that they have a mind, they can think, they have a will. Oh boy, my beagle has a will. And, and they have emotions. Maybe not in the same sense that we do, but clearly dogs and cats can have sad days and happy days. They express their emotions typically with their tail wags and so forth. And when they know they're in trouble, the tail droops down. And so guess what? You have a relationship with a dog. Try that with a pet lizard. Just try it. It just doesn't work. They just look at you and roll their eyes. If it's a chameleon, their eye, one eye goes that way, the other goes that way, and it's like, I'm not even listening to you. There's a big difference, right? You just know this. Well, here's in the scripture is telling us that God made these creatures. They're bara creation. They're special, and they're special for a reason. And the reason is that they can have a relationship with us. Isn't that neat? And you'll see in a moment that other animals that God's going to create are very important for us. It's not just so that we can have, pet dogs and cats. It's much more important, as we'll see in a moment. Now, it was also during this time that science tells us there was this dramatic event in history. And this is what we call the Cambrian explosion. Some of you may have heard of this. This is the cover of Time magazine talking about evolution's Big Bang. They attribute it to evolution, which is fine. I'm attributing it to the creator of the universe, concordant with what he said here at this point on day 5, when he bara created a whole set of brand new things. Well, what were these brand new things? Well, about 543, now it's pretty precise, by the way, million years ago, there was a sudden and dramatic increase in the number of animal kinds on Earth. It took place in less than 10 million years, which in the timeline of the Earth was very, very short. And in evolutionary time periods is absolutely unbelievable to evolutionary biologists and scientists. Like, they can't explain this because it should take far longer in their minds if evolution is the driver, which is a great argument for creation versus evolution, by the way. This was the beginning of the burst of animals on the earth. Now, what happened here was a whole bunch of brand new animals were created, mostly sea animals. You may know that a phyla is a creature with a unique body plan, okay? So different creatures, if you look at especially invertebrate animals, they have pretty weird body plans, some of them. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about, our body plan is basically a tube inside a tube. So we have a spinal column that sits inside another tube, which is the rest of us, okay? This is at a very gross sort of macro level. 70 different phyla or body plans came into existence in the Cambrian explosion in a geological instant in time. And just over 70 different phyla have ever existed, ever. Of those 70, 40 of them have already gone extinct. So there's this burst of creation, and then there's the extinction of these body plans, and no new ones are ever seen in the geologic record. This is the Cambrian explosion. And here's just an excerpt from that, from Time magazine. Just talking about, it says, then 543 million years ago in the early Cambrian, with the span of no more than 10 million years, creatures with teeth and tentacles and claws and jaws materialized with the suddenness of apparitions. Listen to the language. In a burst of creativity. Oh, no. Evolution doesn't create. Sorry, you're not allowed to use that word, but they used it. Like nothing before or since, nature appears. Oh, nature's doing this. Okay, fine. Nature appears to have sketched out the blueprints for virtually the whole of the animal kingdom. This explosion of biological diversity is described by scientists as biology's Big Bang. Isn't that wonderful? It's very exciting. And it's not threatening to our faith whatsoever. In fact, it corroborates our faith. I hope you see that. So we have marine invertebrates appearing early on and various fish types that show up about 400 million years ago. Um, Dinosaurs show up about 250 million years ago. Birds appear about 50 to 100 million years ago, along with marine animals, some really big ones, and some slightly smaller ones. Genesis and science agree that there was this sudden outburst of animal life. So let's remember, Genesis is just giving us the basics. It's not intending to give every detail, okay? It's the basics, enough that we understand the when and the how, but mostly the why. The why. Many of the animals aren't mentioned. You may have noticed that in the Bible, that there are no dinosaurs mentioned. There's no insects. There's no sea sponges. There's no starfish or octopi. None of those are specifically mentioned. So what? Doesn't matter. That wasn't the purpose of the writer of the various books of the Bible, to go into every single detail and give us a taxonomy of everything that God's ever created. We just need to know that he created them. However, all our needs are mentioned, our needs. Okay, and we're going to talk about this in just a moment. What do we need? Well, we need clothing. We need to be warm. We need to have, food and sustenance. Aha, so we're going to get to that. Keep us alive, keep the animals alive. The thing about the Bible is that it was written for anyone, anywhere, at any time. You don't have to be scientific. You don't have to have all this understanding. You just need to read it as it says. You might have some questions about the order and so on and how come, but hopefully I've straightened some of that out for you tonight. Okay, let's carry on with our discussion on animals. God said, let the land produce living creatures, nephesh, according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to their kind. It was so. God made asa, the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures. Remember that these are all part of the bara creation, even though we're now seeing the word asa again. This is the manufacturing, using existing material, of brand new types of creatures known as the nephesh. Okay. About 350 million years ago, most scientists, biologists will tell you that animal life took off on land. But it wasn't until only about 50 million years ago that the number and kinds of mammals grew so great that this time is sometimes referred to as the age of mammals. And now we have the appearance of the large quadrupeds. This is a wildebeest. We have livestock creatures like sheep. We've got animals that stay low to the ground like rodents and rabbits, which are, I'm sorry to say, potential fur and food. Wild animals, which could be tamed or domesticated and used by man, or beasts of burden that, again, could be used by more intelligent beings that had not yet been created. Isn't it interesting? God made these creatures before we even showed up. Why? Because our coming was anticipated and planned. God is a great project manager. So Genesis and the record of nature agree that these specific, more advanced animals are relatively recent. So now we have life-supporting air, a water cycle, plants, land, visible sun, moon, and stars, sea life, birds, potential beasts of burden. We've got livestock for food. We've got material for making clothing and shelters. And everything is all set for humans. Here we come. Then God said, let us make asa. That's odd. Human beings in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created bara, human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And so we see bara is used here for the creation of humans, a brand new type of physical being, something the earth had never seen before, and that is a spiritual creature. The Lord formed something, hence the word asa, from existing materials, but made them unique, a bara creation by making them in God's image. Notice that the nephesh creatures, the advanced animals, are not made in God's image. Only we are. So what does the record of nature say? What do scientists say about humanity? And this gets into, paleobiology and a lot of biochemical stuff, which is my background, incidentally. And where we are today in terms of all the studies that have been done, and this includes things you may have heard of like Y chromosomal and mitochondrial DNA studies, epigenetics, population studies, they're continuing even as we speak because they're trying to get a more precision around these numbers. But about 100 to 200,000 years ago, plus or minus 50,000 years, a new species appeared on the planet that would change everything forever. And these creatures were utterly unique. The studies that are going on, as I mentioned, are trying to refine that 50,000 years. But what we do know fairly accurately, most Christians that are involved in this field of work would say that it's not 10 or 20 or 30,000 years ago. It's definitely in the six figures, but the error bars are being refined. And so we'll see as we go forward. The bottom line is that when humans arrived, everything changed. Why? Because they were different. How were they different? Well, for starters, they questioned their existence. They displayed evidence of a moral conscience. They showed concern over death and the afterlife. How do we know this? Well, because of art. Something very interesting about these humans, they manufactured tools using tools. There are other hominids that use tools, that's true, but no hominids that we have ever found in terms of evidence for it have ever made tools with tools. Only humans have done that. They had complex art and language and music. Language probably being the most sophisticated thing that sets us apart from every other animal. This is a picture of the School of Athens by Raphael, who painted this around 1510. And you can see two guys in the middle of this picture. The guy on the left is Socrates, is Plato, and the guy on the right is Aristotle. And these two philosophers really capture what makes humans unique. The one, Plato, emphasizes the ideals, concepts, and principles, whereas Aristotle emphasized the details, the particulars, the stuff, the reality, if you like. And that's what philosophy is all about, is teasing out both of these things. And theology, same thing. So humans are unique in doing this kind of thinking. They had an awareness of a God, and they exhibited a desire to worship God, just like we started this evening. Why do we do that? Well, because we're made in his image and we have this relationship with God. They had a desire to discover truth. Even the notion that truth is something that can be discovered is a human trait. Animals aren't out there trying to discover the truth. They're just looking for their next meal, and I don't blame them. That's fine. Okay, and that creature, of course, is Homo sapiens sapiens, or modern humans, us. The word sapiens, by the way, comes from the word sapiens, and it's Latin for sapere, and from the Latin word sapere, which basically means wisdom. That's what the word means. And these new creatures had the ability to think and act using knowledge, experience, understanding, common sense, and insight. And all of these things are what sets humans apart, among other things. So Genesis and nature agree that humankind, which was an utterly unique human being, was the last creature to appear on Earth. Isn't that fascinating? All right. Not too much longer. We're going to have time to take a break and take some questions. I hope this has been interesting. I have no way of knowing that you haven't all just fallen asleep. Anyway, Rest. As we all know, God rested after all his work. Let's just read quickly. So thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating, bara, that he had done. So it's important for us to keep in mind that God didn't, rest from everything. He didn't disconnect from his universe. He didn't go on holiday. That's deism, right? God brought it all into existence, and then he's been off having a holiday somewhere and isn't engaged with us or with this universe. That is deism. Theism says that God is personally engaged with us, right down to a personal level as individuals. But it's important to notice that the rest of God was the work of creating. He rested from creating. He didn't just rest. He rested from the work of creating. Well, what does that mean? And why is that important? Why am I even pointing that out? Well, it's because bara is used here. In other words, nothing new or unique is created after humans. And this is exactly what we see. There's been nothing new under the sun. And another thing just for you to notice is that the seventh day has no end. So it didn't end. There's no morning or no evening and morning. We're still in the seventh day. Okay. What does the record of nature say? Well, scientists are aware of this fact, that ever since humans appeared on the earth, there hasn't been anything significantly new added to the planet. No new species, no new nothing. Moreover, rather than a planet bursting with creativity, extinction seems to be what's going on wherever we look. Genesis and science, therefore, agree that since humankind appeared, there has been nothing new under the sun. And this is God's rest. So, what can we say in conclusion? Genesis is not a science textbook, but God's record and nature's record seem to be in harmony. The writer of Genesis, living thousands of years ago, nailed the order of events, one that we've, as scientists, only recently discovered. We have a planet that appears to have been made just for us. Incidentally, just going back to that last point, the chances of somebody guessing there's about 13 different events in the days 1 through 6. The chance of guessing that is, if for the mathematicians in the room, is 13 factorial, which is one chance in 6.227 billion. That's pretty slim odds. Science and the Bible reveal a remarkable harmony in our view. Okay, if you want more information, I would recommend you go to reasons.org, where there's lots and lots of information you can look up and check out whatever interests you from the things that we have discussed tonight. So if you want to take maybe just a 5-minute break, everybody have a bio break or whatever you guys need on that side, then we can take some questions. Sound good? Thumbs up, Bruno? Yes? Okay. I see you nodding. All right. I'll see you in 5 minutes.
I've only got you on the computer speakers, so I'm concerned that people might not be able to hear you. So I think I'll turn on the main speakers when you give your answer.
Okay.
And then if anyone has a question, what I think would be a great idea is if you came up a little closer so that Don could hear you in the computer speaker. So are you ready, Don?
Yeah, that's worked for us in the past really well. Just come in close to the computer, ask your question, then go sit down, and then I'll answer as best I can.
Okay, great. Who would like to begin?
The only dumb question is the one you don't ask.
So, like, what are the parameters? Is it just Genesis or like?
Oh, if Anna's just wondering what the parameters are. If we can ask questions outside Genesis also, or just Genesis.
When you say parameters, what do you mean?
Like, how broad are the questions? Could it be anything? Or
Yeah,
into
sure. Yeah, I mean, if I can't answer it, I'm not going to pretend, and I'll just tell you. But I have a fairly broad experience when it comes to apologetics and things like this. So um, feel free to ask broader questions.
Okay, Chris has got a question.
Yeah. Is the word bara used anywhere else in the Bible, and in what kind of context? Maybe maybe outside of Genesis, or outside of referring to creation.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So the answer is no. It's used solely within the context of Genesis 1, as far as I can recall. And that's kind of why it's such a special word, because it's only there that we see this brand new creative activity of God. Remember that Genesis in Hebrew means, well, it's not in Hebrew, but the word for Genesis, it means beginnings. It means the book of beginnings. And so naturally, this is where we expect to see the work that God did at the beginning. And so it would not be appropriate to use that word in reference to create outside of that passage. But I don't want to say absolutely that's the case. I'd have to go and verify that. But yeah, bara is mostly used. Typically, other places where things are being made or whatever, then it's a different Hebrew word. One of the other ones that we looked at. Good question.
Okay.
Okay, so how God made Eve out of Adam, but out of his rib, right? But it was only XY chromosomes and females are XX, right?
That's right. Men are
Is
XY.
that a creation then?
So, so when we looked at that verse, it says that the creation of man, essentially humankind, it says that God made men and women in his image. And so male and female, I guess, is the correct terminology. In modern parlance, it would be the two genders were made by God and only two, and they were male and female, but both were made in God's image. In Genesis chapter 2, which is an interesting discussion, which we haven't got a lot of time to go into, but basically Genesis 2 has a different approach to the creative activity of Genesis 1. It goes into more detail, for example, around the creation of human beings, as you just pointed out. The whole thing of Adam going to sleep and God making Eve out of from his side is a new piece of information. But Genesis chapter 2, the writer of Genesis had a different purpose in writing the second chapter than in writing the first. The second chapter is more topical related, and therefore it is not sequential. And so there are some things that are out of sequence if you pay close attention, but it's because the writer wasn't worried about that at that point. They'd already set the sequence in chapter 1. There were no chapters, of course, in Genesis. You know that. But anyway, at that section of the Torah. So the Asa manufacture of females clearly was based on God using pre-existing material, which actually was, in some sense, a piece of Adam. Now, did he literally take out something from Adam to do this? We don't know. But what we do know is that there was a very strong connection, which goes right up to the whole basis of the unity of men and women when they get married. They become one flesh, again, which harkens right back to Genesis chapter 2. And so there was definitely, God used the substance that he had made man out of to make woman as well. And that's why Adam says, you are bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. But did he literally take out a rib? No, not necessarily. That could have been some license by the writer of Genesis. I know I've met Christians who say, do men have one less rib than women? And because of what they see in Genesis, and the answer to that is no. We all have the same number of ribs. I hope that helps.
That's funny. My grandfather always taught us that we had one less rib.
That is a biological falsehood. Sorry.
Go ahead. Carolyn's got a question.
So I was wondering, in the Bible it says that God created man from the earth. That's why we're called humans, like from the earth.
Mm-hmm.
But scientists would say that we evolved from other animals. So how do we reconcile those differences?
Right. Well, great question. Thank you for asking it. Remember I said that even in Genesis, we see two aspects of God's creation. The bara part, which is us being made in his image, which has to do with our spiritual nature, our capacity for the things that God can do on a more limited basis, such as, searching out truth, music, art. All of these things are part of being the imago Dei, the image of God, right? The asa, manufactured part of us, the Bible says, as you said, from the dust of the earth. He made us from stuff that existed. And we know that, the stuff that you need to make a human being is not all that complicated in terms of the raw materials. It's how you put the raw materials together that is unbelievably complicated. If you take all the water out of a human body, for example, you end up with a bag of chemicals that weighs about, 5 pounds. That's it, right? So we're a bunch of phosphorus, calcium, et cetera, and some rare earth elements and a few other things. And that's what we're made out of. We're all made out of stuff that God made beforehand and then used to manufacture us physically. But our inherent nature is that of a bara creation, which is in the image of God. Now, where scientists disagree, including Christian scientists, incidentally, is on how this happened. Did God literally, scoop up some dust from the earth and go, woof, there you go, there's Adam? Or was there a gradual creating process where humans kind of evolved, if you like, by God's hand, not through naturalism, but by God's own hand from pre-existing animals? And this is the area that we call theistic evolution. And there are a number of very good scientists who are strong believers, brothers and sisters in Christ, who would agree with that. And they believe that the data points to this gradual creation of man from pre-existing animals, namely hominids, other hominids, hominids that predated humans. Reasons to Believe's perspective is that we were a unique physical creation as well. Now, there are different sort of areas to move around in the room as to, okay, it's a unique creation, but did God start with something that was there and then modify it so that you end up with a Homo sapiens sapiens? Or was it like, tapping a bucket and poof, out comes, Adam? We don't know, right? What we do know is that when we do these studies, these Y chromosomal, mitochondrial DNA studies and so forth, population studies, it does appear that Homo sapiens sapiens came onto the scene abruptly. There was no sort of mixing. And initially, it was believed that Neanderthals, for example, and humans, although they kind of overlapped in time, there was no interbreeding. But that's actually not true. In the last 10 years, we've been able to ascertain that, in fact, humans, early humans, and Neanderthals did breed, and that's why we have a very, very small proportion of Neanderthal DNA in our DNA. But the question is, what does that mean in terms of us being a unique creation? We still are 98% completely unique. So it's a great question. And Christians have different ideas and views on this. But the main point to keep in mind is that God had an active hand in the creation of human beings. That's the most important piece to keep in mind. I hope that helps.
Oh,
And at the same time, he doesn't want to ask questions because he's not a believer anymore. And he's not, his questions are not necessarily seeking answers from the Bible.
okay.
He just wants to listen. No, he wants to join the Zoom meeting and ask the presenter. Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
That's
He wants to have a debate.
kind of.
Okay, let's see. So Don, we have a man online, and I wonder if the best way to, yeah, at any rate, we have a man online who would like to speak to you. He used to be a believer. Oh, he was a Muslim before. What is he doing now? Is he an atheist now, or? Okay. And so he's got some questions about why God isn't doing anything type thing. And so I think he would, I'm trying to navigate this. He would like to join you just on Zoom and chat with you. Maybe afterwards, after the rest
Well,
of the questions.
I'm happy. I'm happy if you can get the two of us connected. Maybe it wouldn't be appropriate now,
Yeah.
given the audience and everybody there. But if this gentleman would like to speak to me one-on-one, I'm happy to do that. And just you can provide my email address, Rob, to this individual, and have that person just reach out to me, and we'll try and set up a time. I'm happy to do that.
Cool. So yeah, if you want to let him know, we'll pass on Don's email to him.
Does that work?
Yeah. Awesome.
Okay, great.
Any other awesome questions? Yeah, Francis has got a question. Right up here.
Yeah. Hi, Don.
Hi, Francis.
So there's I guess people who believe in more of a young Earth versus people who are, I guess, more aligned with how science understands the creation of the universe. I guess it's more of a broader question because I guess it affects how we interpret the Bible. Is it more literal, or is it more we have to figure out how it fits to the worldview? I'm just curious if you could comment on your perspective on this.
Sure. Thanks for asking that question. So maybe before I answer the question, I should just give you a little bit more of my own background. I grew up in a Christian home, nominal Christian home, but when I was my early teens, I rejected Christianity completely and wanted nothing more to do with it, and became a pretty typical rebel teenager kid growing up in North America, and got into all the usual trouble. But and this decision I made with my older brother, and but he came back from university talking about Jesus, and I just thought he'd smoked too many magic mushrooms, and we got talking, and basically he just took me back to the Bible, and he showed me that the Bible wasn't some weird book, like I thought it was, but it actually, made a lot of sense. And so I eventually became a Christian after many years of rebellion, and but it wasn't my upbringing necessarily that was that. It was being convinced by what I read in the scriptures, and also I was a bit of a scientist from early days, interested in science, and went on to pursue formal scientific studies. But I was a young Earth creationist for many years, because if you're a Christian and you're interested in science in the late 1960s, early 1970s, there was no other view. There were no other books available. So the only thing you could get your hands on was the Genesis flood and a few other books like that were written by a number of, well, one or two organizations, Creation Research and a few others. But at the end of the day, I started reading these books, and I thought it was so cool. Here we are. You can be a Christian and you can be scientific, and isn't that neat? But as I started to kind of look into the details of what the claims were and the basis for their viewpoint, I started to have questions, because it didn't line up with a lot of things that I understood from the scientific endeavor. And I also felt like they were forcing the scriptures to say things that could be interpreted or understood in different ways. And so I eventually kind of left that view, and I didn't have any view for a number of years until I really ran into Hugh Ross. And I started to really embrace and understand that there is this concordance between the scriptures if we interpret both with honesty and with open minds. And many of the claims about young Earth, a young Earth, meaning less than 10,000 years old, are based on a very specific understanding of the Bible. And they would say that they're taking the Bible literally, but in actual fact, that isn't true. They're taking the English of the Bible literally. But if you take the Hebrew or the Greek, which is how the languages the Bible was written in, if you take them literally, then you can reach vastly different conclusions. And so it's this forcing essentially their interpretation in English of the Bible that they have in their hands, which is where the problem begins. The second part that's a problem is essentially a rejection of science as not being credible by many young Earth creationists. And this is really a difficulty for people who come from scientific backgrounds. They are basically told that they have to surrender their science and stop thinking that way and just believe what the Bible says. When by that they mean you have to believe what I say it says. And so for all those reasons, I have challenges with the young Earth view. And if someone is of that persuasion, I'm more than happy to engage in a discussion around the specifics. People put up all kinds of reasons for why they believe the Earth is young. But if there's scientific reasons, then they can be easily refuted. And I would say to you that the most compelling evidence that the Earth is not young is the one I referred to early on today, and that is just look at the moon. If all of the bombardment of the moon that you can see with the naked eye occurred in the last 6,000 to 10,000 years, we wouldn't be here. So that means that had to have happened long before. So that's just one example. There are many others. The speed of light, distances to stars, expanding universe, the redshift of all galaxies on the extremities of our universe, all of which can be calculated. Those velocities and those distances cannot be brought into a world where there's only 6,000 to 10,000 years of creation. And it's interesting that Hugh Ross, because he's a professional and he publishes along with the other scholars at RTB, there was a big meeting in the US about 10 years ago where they invited some of the young Earth astronomers and astrophysicists, and there are some, to a conference with their peers. So basically, they got every Christian astronomer and astrophysicist and cosmologist in the United States together in one conference. And they basically said, all right, you guys present your views, and we're going to listen, and then we're going to talk about it. And they did. And basically, the conclusion of that conference was that there was just no support for a universe of very young age. So I hope that helps. There are many, many things that we could talk about, specific questions you might have when it comes to young Earth, but I try to just give you a broad response. Other questions?
Any other questions? Okay. Well, I think we are. I think we are pretty close to out of questions. I think the whole young Earth thing is interesting. Yeah, not having a lot of information, I tend to lean young Earth, but I can't say either way, just not having a lot of information. But I have really liked learning about Hugh Ross's in your position, especially with the point of reference of the Spirit over the waters and whatnot. That is new to me. I'd never heard that before, and that makes a lot of sense. So,
well, you're not
yeah.
alone, Rob. I mean, if you're an average Christian growing up in an evangelical church in North America, you're more than likely to hear a young Earth perspective, and that's because there's just a lot of material out there, and it's quite common. But as I've come to learn that it's partly because of good funding and and some other things, but at the end of the day, I'm really convinced that we need to broaden our understanding, and it's become a gospel issue, and it has been for some time. I've run into many people in talks I've given where they've said, look, if you're telling me that the Earth is X, then I just can't. I could never get past that and accept your gospel. At the end of the day, whether the Earth is young or not is irrelevant to the gospel, right? It doesn't make. You can be a Christian and believe either or. You really can. It's not a salvation issue, is what I'm trying to say. But for scientists who study and work in geophysics and in other disciplines where age is important and something they do day in and day out, it's a stumbling block or an obstacle to faith. And so I believe that that's where we need to remove those obstacles so that they can come to faith. But it is not a salvation issue.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. I still like listening to the young Earthers though, because I find some of it compelling. So, but yeah, I don't think I've got it figured out. But I really appreciate you joining us today, and I think that's been really helpful. So
Great.
yeah.
Well, I believe Bruno is there, and he's got some books with him and stuff. So I would encourage you to engage with Bruno. He, like I said, and I'm not kidding, he knows more than I do. So to ask him some questions, and he'd be happy to help as well. And then he can point you to some of the books that are really excellent reference material. And we're not here to push RTB. It's just that it's basically an organization that has got a pretty wide umbrella and has pulled together a lot of people that are scientists and people of faith, and they found a home there, and that's why the organization's grown. But there are other Christians and other organizations that have different views. I get that. So enjoy some of the books if you can, and thanks for looking after Bruno. And you know how to reach me if there's any follow-up questions, Rob. If people walk out and they go, oh, I wish I'd asked that or whatever. by all means, feel free to send them to me by email, and I'll do my best.
Awesome. Hey, can
Thank
we
you